Okay, so I will start with the first part of the talk, and then my colleagues Nastya and Natasha will take the second and third part. Um, we started our research from the general observation that contact varieties of Russian feature word order patterns that are not typical of standard Russian. This regards both the sentence level and the phrase level, but in this paper we will only focus on word order variation in noun phrases with the genitive modifier. Whereas in standard monolingual Russian, the unmarked order in the noun phrase is head plus genitive, this is what we call right genitives, as in brat atsa, so the brother of my father. In contact varieties of Russian used by speakers of minority languages of Russian, we often find the opposite order, so genitive plus noun, plus head noun. And this is what we call left genitive. So the parallel of the example above would be atsa brat, my father's brother. The questions we're asking are, why do bilingual speakers frequently use left genitives in their Russian speech? And are left genitives in their speech indeed significantly more frequent than in the speech of monolinguals? So the first hypothesis is that left genitives in bilingual speech copy syntactic patterns that are typical of the first languages, of their first languages. And this hypothesis is supported by the fact that most of the indigenous languages of Russia are indeed left branching. So the dependent is usually placed to the left of its head. The second hypothesis would be that left genitives in bilingual speech are actually motivated by a general weaker pressure of prescriptive norms and by the type of texts we consider, which are oral and spontaneous texts. And this second hypothesis is supported by the fact that although left genitives are not typical of standard written Russian, they are attested in monolingual oral speech and especially in dialectal varieties. So we carried out a comparative quantitative analysis based on data from spoken corpora. We started with Dagestani Russian, which is the variety we examined more in detail to investigate the distribution of left versus right genitives. And so the question was, do left genitives occur equally in all types of noun phrases? And if they don't, then can we explain the choice between left versus right genitives by the specific features of possessive noun phrases marking in the speaker's first languages? So to extend the scope of our research, we included other contact varieties of Russian, although we examined them less in detail compared to Dagestani and Russian. And these varieties are Chuvash, Bashkir, and Southern Tungusic Russian. And as a benchmark, we also included monolingual Russian, not only standard Russian, but also several dialectal varieties. So I will briefly introduce the data, so the spoken corpora of both bilingual and monolingual varieties of Russian we used. So here you see a map of, which shows where such varieties are spoken. So the green point at the bottom of the map is Dagestani, represents Dagestani Russian, which is spoken in the Republic of Dagestan. The orange point is Chuvash Russian, spoken in Chuvashia. The blue point is Bashkir Russian, spoken in the Republic of Bashkortostan. And on the right, you see so the 2 points representing Tungusic Russian, and specifically the red point represents Nanai, and the violet point, Olch. So just a few words about how possessive noun phrases are built in the speaker's first languages. We find different strategies. So in some cases, we have dependent marking with the genitive case, and This is the case for all Naccarato languages and for Turkic languages in some contexts. The alternative strategy is head marking with possessive affixes, and this is the case for Tungusic languages and for Turkic languages. Again, Turkic languages actually can combine the two strategies. But what is more relevant for our research is that no matter the type of marking, dependent nouns are usually preposed. So they are placed to the left of their heads. And this is typical of all the first languages we're dealing with. So let's start with Dagestani Russian. This is the biggest corpus we have for bilingual varieties. And it includes social-linguistic interviews with 35 speakers of Dagestani and Turkic languages. After a selection process, we extracted 482 noun phrases with a genitive modifier. And here, so in one, we show how a noun phrase with the genitive modifier looks like in one of the first languages included. In this case, we have Avar. And so here we have dependent marking with the genitive case, so Muhammad's pencil. And in two, we have an example of Dagestani Russian. This is an example from a speaker of Avar. And so here in the noun phrase is Dedushki Sistru. So the genitive is placed before the head, whereas in standard Russian, you would have the opposite order, Sistru, Dedushki. For Chuvash Russian, so we have a smaller corpus. Here we have interviews from 14 speakers from the village of Malaya Karachkina in Chuvashia. And after the selection process, we extracted only 76 examples. This will be an important information for the discussion, for the following discussion. So here in three, you see an example, well, actually two examples of noun phrases, of possessive noun phrases in Chuvash. So in the first noun phrase, the girl's beauty, you see that we have both dependent marking with the genitive case and head marking with a possessive affix, while in the second noun phrase, sunlight, we only have head marking. We won't go into details about this, the choice between different types of marking, but in general, we can say that the choice of dependent or head marking mainly depends on the referentiality of the dependent. And in four, you see an example of Chuvash Russian. And so here again, we have a left genitive. So we have Svikrovi brat, my mother-in-law's brother. Whereas in standard Russian, we would have the opposite order. For Bashkir, so the corpus is bigger than Chuvash Russian, but still smaller than Dagestani Russian. It contains interviews with 7 speakers from the village of Baimovo in the Republic of Bashkortostan. And after the selection process, we extracted 304 examples. In 5, you see an example of Bashkir, in which you see that in the noun phrase, we have both dependent marking with the genitive case and head marking with a possessive affix. And in 6, we have an example of Bashkir Russian, again with a left genitive. So начальник классов, учительницы. And finally, Tungusic Russian. So here the corpus contains about 70,000 tokens, interviews with 35 speakers from villages of Khabarovsk Krai. And here in 7, you see an example from Nanai. in the noun phrase, we have head marking, my husband's grandmother. And in 8, we show an example of Nanai Russian. So again, as in the examples before, we have a left genitive, моего брата дерево. Okay, so now we can move to monolingual varieties of Russian, and so I will give the floor to Nastya.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We also took some data from monolingual varieties of Russian, namely Standard Russian and several Russian dialects. The geographical distribution of these varieties is shown on the map. Next slide. So for Standard Russian, we had 2 oral text collections. First, the spoken subcorpus of the Russian National Corpus, which actually is bigger. We took the part of it which is comparable to our bilingual data in terms of text types and genres. The second collection is a corpus of Russian spoken in Zvenigrad, which is a town located near Moscow. So of course, in the majority of our examples, the genitive was on the right, but several examples with the left genitives also occurred. Here you see one such example. У нас-то вот муж и сестра, and here is my husband's sister. Next. As for dialectal Russian, we had 4 corpora of different size, which represent southern Russian dialects, namely dialects spoken in Tambov district, villages Rogovatka, Spiridonova Buda, and Malinina. One small corpus of one of the middle dialects, and we also had a relatively big spoken corpus of one northern Russian dialect, Ustya River Basin corpus. For the present study, we annotated only part of it. So it turned out that in Russian dialects, left genitives also occur, and here you see one example from one of the southern dialects, which you see here the noun phrase моряков жены, sailors' wives. So we analyzed all these various kinds of data and got some results, which I will present in the next section. Yes, we started with the Gisanian Russian, and probably the most important thing that we found out is that left genitives do not occur equally in all types of noun phrases. In other words, there are some factors that favor the occurrence of left genitives. To determine the significance of these factors, we used a logistic regression model, which we describe in details in this forthcoming paper. And here I will present only the results. So the first statistically significant factor is the lexical class of the head. If the head of the noun phrase is a kinship term, for example, Karim's mother, then the genitive is highly likely to be proposed. The second factor is the lexical class of the genitive. In general, you see that genitives denoting human reference are more likely to be proposed than those denoting non-human reference. And the rate of left genitives is high for kinship terms, then for proper names, and then for the other human reference. We also found 3 other factors that make their own small contribution to the word order choice. So it turned out that genitives which are multi-word, definite, and produced by female speakers are also likely to be proposed. The next slide.
Yeah.
Thank you. After that, we decided to investigate whether other varieties of Russian show the same picture in terms of frequency and distribution. So we extracted all noun phrases with genitive modifiers, annotated the position of the genitive, left to right, and the parameters that proved to affect the most of the Dagestanian data, namely kinship semantics of the head and the modifier. Of course, we were especially interested in monolinguals data because Standard Russian and dialectal Russian were supposed to clarify whether we are indeed dealing with a language contact phenomenon or it's just due to the degree of effectiveness by prescriptive norms. The next slide. Yes, this slide is about frequency of left genitives in our data. So what we're trying to do is to check whether the rate of left genitives in non-standard Russian corpora is significantly higher than the rate of left genitives in standard Russian. According to this graph, the percentage of left genitives in Dagestanian and Tungusic Russian is indeed significantly higher, while for Chuvash and Bashkir Russian, it is high, but not significantly. What is important for our contact hypothesis, the percentage of left genitives in Russian dialects turned out to be comparable to that of bilingual varieties and significantly higher than in standard Russian. And turning to the distribution of left genitives across different types of noun phrases, we can say that in all contact varieties except Bashkir Russian, yeah, I see, 5 minutes. Except Bashkir Russian, left genitives are favored by noun phrases where the head is a kinship term. Yes, interestingly, the same tendency is attested in monolinguals data, but in standard Russian, in comparison to all other varieties, this tendency is significantly weaker. And our next slide is about semantics of the genitive dependent. Yes, since kinship semantics is evidently a crucial factor, here we show just kinship, non-kinship distinction. And the results for the genitive dependent is almost the same as for the head on the previous slide. So for all contact varieties except for Bashkir, the rate of left genitives is significantly higher for genitives with kinship semantics. And the same tendency is attested in dialectal standard Russian, but in standard Russian, it is significantly weaker. So everything is almost the same. And now Natalia will tell you how we interpret all these results.
Yes, thank you. Kira, the next slide, please. Can you hear me? So I will briefly summarize our observations. First, the rate of left genitives is in fact significantly higher in some bilingual varieties than in standard Russian. However, unexpectedly not in all our varieties. And what is even more interesting, not in all monolingual patterns will have the lower rate of left genitives. In dialectal speech, it is comparable to that of bilingual Russian. And also we revealed some semantic factors favoring the use of left genitives, and they are related to kinship semantics. Kinship terms must be in dependent and head positions. And these factors are equally relevant for all bilingual varieties under consideration. And it is interesting that the same factors are also relevant for monolinguals, even for standard speakers, although the tendency is weaker in standard Russian. Kiara, next slide, yeah. And how to interpret our data. Our initial hypothesis was that left genitives in bilingual speech simply copy L1 syntactic patterns of native languages of our speakers. However, this hypothesis cannot explain the high rate of left genitives observed in monolingual dialects. And an argument against this hypothesis is that the same factors, namely kinship semantics, are relevant equally for all our bilingual varieties. And these factors cannot be explained by any split attested in noun phrase mark and attested in the specific native languages themselves. And one even more important counter-argument is that exactly the same factors are relevant both for bilinguals and monolinguals. Chiara, the next slide.
I move to the next one.
Yeah. Thank you. So we formulated an alternative hypothesis that left genitives attested in bilingual speech are motivated not by contact, but simply by a weaker pressure of prescriptive norms and the type of texts in our bilingual corpora. And it helps us to explain the special behavior of our Bashkir data, which show a very standard behavior. And these data come from a very small and very homogeneous group of speakers, which are all oriented towards the use of very standard Russian. They are mostly school teachers. And also, this hypothesis this hypothesis gives uniform account both for the use of left genitives in monolinguals, in our bilingual varieties, and in monolingual dialects. And the thing is that both dialectal speech and bilingual speech is not affected by the pressure of prescriptive norms. And in the case of left genitives, so we can call our left, we can consider our left genitives as vernacular universal, and we can hypothesize that it is motivated not by contact, but by language natural development, by some universal cross-linguistic factors which work better in case when there is no strong pressure of norms. Chiara. The next slide, please. Yes, and if so, we have to explain our factors regulating the choice, the word order choice, without appealing to contact influence. But and we have an explanation. We can say that the effect of kinship semantics can be related to processing easing. It's easier for a speaker to start with a reference point with a so-called anchor, and then in our case this is dependent noun when the speaker describes, for example, John's father's brother. It's easier for him and for the addressee to identify the brother of whom, the father of whom. It's easier to start with John and then turn to father and then to brother. And this tendency was reported to be cross-linguistically relevant. And yes, Chiara, maybe the next slide. Yes. So our brief conclusion is that in bilingual varieties of Russian, the non-standard word order often occurs. And at first glance, this phenomenon might be quite easily explained in terms of simple syntactic cutting from left branching languages in contact with Russian. However, a more detailed corpus-based analysis of several different contact varieties of Russian shows that there is no strong evidence of contact influence of simple calking. Rather, our data point to an effect caused by lower pressure of prescriptive norms. However, the whole picture seems to be not so easy. Chiara, maybe the last slide or the next slide. And probably we need further research. First, to confirm our second hypothesis on prescriptive norms, we should check more carefully social linguistic parameters such as age and level of education of speakers and so on, and parameters related to gender in the register. And for varieties in contact with for our contact varieties, we should search more carefully for parameters other than kinship semantics to exclude the possibility of L1 pattern coding. Thank you. Here you can see some other example showing that there are, in fact, in our data some syntactic calques, but not concerning the word order choice itself. So the whole picture is a bit more complicated. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really exciting talk. Lots of awesome data. Any questions? Remember, you can raise your hand or type it into the Q&A. And Natalia has a question, so I will make sure to, well, you can unmute yourself, Natalia, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
I just, I think I can't raise my hand. So that's really fascinating. And so my question is, I'm really curious, what do you think? I don't know if there is an answer to this question, but is this difference between non-standard bilingual and monolingual Russian varieties and standard Russian, is it because, so there can be two explanations. First, maybe that non-standard varieties are kind of less dependent on this prescriptivism, and maybe they are more malleable and maybe they yield better to these processing factors like givenness, newness, or length of this light and heavy and so on. So that could be one explanation. Another one is maybe there's just a fewer kinship terms and similar stuff, and maybe a longer dependence in this in your standard Russian data. So, so is this what do you think could be an explanation? So maybe that's why it's just there are fewer constructions of this type, non-canonical genitives in standard Russian, because people speak about different things.
Well, it might be both, actually. So yeah, so we had a big problem with data selection at the very beginning, especially when we were looking for standard Russian data, and the problem was that we couldn't find the right type of texts, of genre, where we could find talks about kinship. In our Dagestani Russian corpus, we had a lot of this because they were social linguistic interviews. So there was this kind of problem. We kind of tried to solve it, but yeah. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. But the first option is also, well, we also like the first idea. I don't know if my colleagues want to add something. Yeah, so it seems to us that that the lower pressure of prescriptive norms also plays a role in this. So
Okay.
factors like referentiality, givenness, topicality is something that matters a lot in this case.
Okay, thanks, fascinating.
Thank you.
Other questions? We do have a comment that you can read in the chat if you'd like, but if there are more questions, that would be, we have time for one more probably.
Thank you very much for this comment. Okay.
Yeah, well, I also have a question. This is really exciting work and such, rich data, and I love the regional varieties. So what do you know, or I know that you know, but did you take into account different types of interaction with Russian in these different contact varieties in different communities? And is that something that is part of your explanation? So is it and I just don't know, so is it the case that in Dagestan, that area, there's more schooling in Russian than other things, or more types of intermarrying or things like that? So is that something that you've thought about, or is there anything to say about that?
That's something we thought about recently, because we were surprised that we found such a big difference between Dagestani Russian and the other contact varieties. And we don't really have an answer to this question now. But it might be the case that, well, actually that the other way around, that Dagestani and Russian, there is less Russian than in the other contact varieties, but I don't think we are ready to answer to this question right now. But yes, that's a good question.
Thank you. That's totally great. So we are done with time. So I'm going to stop the recording, and everyone can come back in half an hour for our final two talks of today. So very exciting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.